Jalen Parker had always been careful. Growing up in a world where a simple misunderstanding could turn into a death sentence, he knew the rules. Keep your hands visible, don't argue, move slow. Comply, but not too eagerly, because that could make them nervous. But none of that mattered when the flashing lights appeared behind him. It was late. Too late. He had been at a friend's house, playing video games, eating takeout, just existing. Now, he was 5 blocks from home, driving his mama's old Honda, when the sirens whooped once. He pulled over immediately. His heart pounded. What did I do? The car was registered. His license was clean. He wasn't speeding. Still, his hands tightened on the wheel as he watched the officer step out of the cruiser. Then another. 2 cops. Jalen's stomach twisted. One officer approached the driver's side, flashlight shining directly into his face. Jalen squinted, forcing himself to stay still, his breathing steady. License and registration, the cop said flatly. Jalen nodded. I'm reaching for it now. He moved slowly, painfully aware of every motion. He handed over the documents, keeping his other hand on the wheel. The officer barely glanced at them. You live around here? Yes, sir. Where are you headed? Home. The cop hummed, then glanced back at his partner. The second officer stood near the trunk, hand resting on his holster. Jalen forced himself to breathe. Step out of the vehicle. Jalen stiffened. Why? The cop's expression didn't change. Step out. Jalen swallowed hard. He had no choice. He unlocked the door and stepped onto the pavement. Turn around. Hands on the car. His pulse hammered. I don't understand. I didn't do... A hand shoved him forward. His chest slammed against the car hood, heat searing through his body as rough hands patted him down. Panic flared. Sir, I didn't do anything. Shut up. His wrists were yanked behind his back. Number. This him? The first cop asked. The second officer walked up, studying his face like he was inspecting a piece of meat. Then he smirked. Yeah, that's him. Jalen's blood ran cold. What? No, you got the wrong guy. I was at my friend's house all night. His words were drowned out by the snap of handcuffs locking around his wrists. And just like that, his life was no longer his own. Because the truth didn't matter. All that mattered was that someone had to take the fall. And tonight, that someone was Jalen Parker. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Jalen's wrists as the officers shoved him toward the back of the squad car. His mind raced, panic clawing at his chest. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. I didn't do anything, he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. The older cop chuckled. Yeah, that's what they all say. Jalen turned his head desperately, looking toward the few houses nearby. Porch lights glowed in the distance, but no one came outside. No one was watching. No witnesses. He twisted in the cop's grip. Please, just call my friend. A sharp crack rang through the air. Pain exploded across his ribs as the officer's baton slammed into his side. Jalen collapsed, gasping, his knees hitting the pavement. Stop resisting, the younger officer muttered. His voice broke. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't doing anything. But they had already decided he was guilty. Rough hands yanked him back to his feet and shoved him into the back of the squad car. His head smacked against the frame, sending another jolt of pain through his skull. The door slammed shut. Jalen blinked through the haze, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Through the window, he could see them talking, laughing, like this was nothing, like he was nothing. The radio crackled. Be advised, we got a robbery suspect matching the description. The older cop grabbed his radio. We already got him. Jalen's stomach twisted. They weren't looking for the real suspect. They never were. Inside the police station, the air was thick with indifference. Jalen sat in the holding cell, his wrists bruised, his ribs throbbing. His hoodie was stained with dirt from where they had thrown him on the ground. He stared at the wall, his mind numb. How many times had he seen this happen to others? On the news, on social media, in protests that flared up and then faded when the world moved on. But now, it was him. The door creaked open. An officer stepped in, holding a clipboard. He was different from the ones who arrested him, older, more tired looking. You Parker? Jalen nodded stiffly. The officer sighed, flipping through his papers. You've been identified as a suspect in an armed robbery that happened earlier tonight. Jalen's head snapped up. I didn't rob anybody. The cop gave him a bored look. You fit the description. Jalen's fists clenched. What description? The officer glanced at his notes. Black male, about 6 foot, wearing dark clothing. Jalen let out a bitter laugh. That describes half the guys in this city. The cop shrugged. Bad luck. Jalen's stomach turned. That was all this was to them. Bad luck. Not injustice. Not a stolen future. Just bad luck. He exhaled sharply. Call my friend. He'll tell you where I was. The cop stared at him for a long moment. Then he smirked. Tell you what, kid, we can make this easy. Jalen tensed. What do you mean? The cop leaned in slightly. You confessed to being at the scene. Say you were around when it happened, but you didn't do it. Maybe we cut you a deal. Jalen's blood ran cold. They wanted him to lie, to give them a reason to pin this on him. His pulse pounded in his ears. If he said no, they'd keep him here for who knows how long. Maybe plant evidence. Maybe let his name hit the news so he'd be a criminal in the court of public opinion before he even got a chance to prove his innocence. But if he said yes, he'd have a record, a felony. His future, gone. Either way, he lost. Jalen clenched his jaw. I want a lawyer. The officer's smirk faded. He clicked his pen, making a note on the clipboard. Then he stood. Suit yourself. The door slammed shut behind him. Jalen exhaled, his whole body trembling. They were trying to break him, but he wasn't going to let them. What none of those cops knew, what none of them expected, was that Jalen Parker wasn't alone in this fight. Because outside, his mother was already on her way, and she wasn't coming quietly. Denise Parker drove like a woman possessed. Her fingers clenched the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her heart hammering as she sped toward the precinct. Every breath felt like fire in her chest. Every second, a reminder that her son was sitting in a cage for something he didn't do. Jalen had always been a good kid. He wasn't perfect, no one was, but he was smart. He stayed out of trouble. He had dreams. And now, those dreams were hanging by a thread because some racist cop had decided he fit the description. Denise had seen this happen before. Mothers crying on the news, sons never making it home. She refused to be one of them. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder. She snatched it up without taking her eyes off the road. Hello? Denise. It was her sister, Monique. I just saw the video. Denise's stomach tightened. What video? The one of Jalen's arrest, Monique said, her voice shaking. Someone was recording. They posted it online. People are pissed. Denise's hands trembled. Send it to me. A few seconds later, her phone dinged. She swiped to open the message, and there it was, grainy but clear enough. Jalen standing still. Jalen complying. Jalen getting shoved, slammed onto the car, cuffed like an animal while he begged them to listen. Denise's blood turned to ice. She swallowed back the rage burning in her throat. Are people sharing it? Denise, it's gone viral. People are already outside the station. They're chanting his name. Denise pressed harder on the gas. Good, she muttered, because they're about to hear mine too. Inside the precinct, Jalen sat with his head in his hands. He was exhausted. His ribs ached. The cold metal bench beneath him felt like it was trying to swallow him whole. He had no idea how long they planned to keep him here. No phone call, no lawyer, just silence. The door to the holding area creaked open. Jalen didn't look up until he heard a familiar voice. Where is my son? His head snapped up. His mother was here. Denise Parker stood at the front desk, her stance rigid, her eyes blazing. She had one hand on her hip, the other gripping her phone like she was ready to use it as a weapon. The officer at the desk, a tired-looking white man, barely glanced at her. Ma'am, we're in the middle of an investigation. Denise slammed her phone onto the counter. You mean this investigation? The officer frowned and looked down at the screen. The video played in full view. Jalen compliant, Jalen brutalized, Jalen not resisting. The officer's face paled. Denise leaned in, her voice ice cold. I want my son out, now. Other officers had started to gather, whispering among themselves. Someone stepped forward, an older black officer with tired eyes. He glanced at the phone, then at Denise. We, need to review this. No. Denise's voice was sharp. You don't need to review anything. The whole damn country has already reviewed it. Her words rang through the precinct. Officers shifted uncomfortably. Someone whispered into a radio. Outside, the chanting grew louder. Denise turned her head and saw it through the station's front windows. Hundreds of people gathered, their signs raised, their voices shaking the walls. Justice for Jalen. Let him go. We see the truth. Denise smirked. She looked back at the officer. Now, you can either open that door and let my son walk out of here, or you can watch this city burn down around you. Your choice. The tension in the room was suffocating. The officer hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he grabbed a key from the desk and nodded at one of the younger cops. A moment later, Jalen's cell door swung open. His breath caught. Get up, kid, the officer muttered. You're free to go. Jalen barely processed it. He stood slowly, his body stiff, his mind still struggling to understand. Then he saw his mother waiting for him, her eyes filled with fire. He stepped forward. She grabbed his face, looking him over, her fingers brushing against the bruise forming on his cheek. They hurt you, she whispered. Jalen swallowed hard. Yeah. Denise exhaled shakily, rage flickering across her face. Then she took his hand and turned toward the exit. Let's go. The second Jalen stepped outside, the crowd erupted. The sound hit him like a wave, people shouting his name, news cameras flashing, hands reaching out to touch his shoulder, to remind him he wasn't alone. His mother raised their joined hands in the air, and the chants swelled. Jalen's chest tightened. All these people, all this noise. For him. A reporter pushed forward, shoving a microphone in his face. Jalen, how do you feel right now? Jalen met the camera head on. I feel like if that video didn't exist, I'd still be in a cell, he said. His voice was hoarse, but steady. And if I had moved even a little differently, I might not be here at all. Silence rippled through the crowd. Jalen clenched his jaw. So, yeah, I feel lucky. His eyes darkened. But I shouldn't have to. The people roared. Jalen exhaled, looking at his mother, then back at the sea of faces staring at him. This wasn't over, because he wasn't the first. And if something didn't change, he damn sure wouldn't be the last. The fight wasn't over. Jalen may have walked out of the police station that night, but the battle had only just begun. The next morning, his face was everywhere. News anchors debated his case on national television. Some called him a victim of racist policing, proof of a broken system. Others searched desperately for a reason to blame him for what had happened. Should he have complied faster? We don't know what happened before the video started. The officers feared for their safety? Jalen turned off the TV, disgusted. They're already twisting it, he muttered. Denise sat beside him, scrolling through her phone. Let them try, she said, voice sharp, the truth's louder. She was right. The protests hadn't stopped. If anything, they had grown. Every night, more people flooded the streets. They weren't just chanting Jalen's name anymore. They were listing all the names. The ones who didn't make it. The ones the world had forgotten. It wasn't just about him. And it never had been. Meanwhile, inside a darkened office at the police station, Officer Daniels sat stiffly in a chair, his arms crossed. Captain Monroe, a grizzled man who had spent decades protecting the thin blue line, sighed as he tossed a file onto the desk. This is bad, Daniels. Daniels clenched his jaw. I did my job. No, Monroe said flatly. You did too much. Daniels scoffed. That kid fit the damn description. Save it. The captain leaned forward, his voice lowering. The mayor's breathing down my neck. The governor's calling for an independent review. We have senators weighing in. Daniel's stomach twisted. He had seen this before. When the heat got too strong, when the system needed a scapegoat, they didn't go after the institution. They went after one man. Monroe sighed, rubbing his forehead. The brass wants someone to blame. He looked up. And it's you. Daniel's heart pounded. You can't be serious. The department is putting you on unpaid leave pending investigation, Monroe said, his voice tired. You need to lawyer up. Daniels shot to his feet. This is bullshit. We had cause. No. Monroe's voice was sharp. You had excuses, and for once, they're not working. Daniels opened his mouth, then shut it. Because deep down, he knew. The system protected its own, but only until it couldn't anymore. And right now, he was expendable. Jalen sat at the kitchen table, staring at the screen in front of him. The headline flashed across the news. Officer Daniels placed on leave amid investigation. He swallowed hard. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was something. His mother stood behind him, resting a hand on his shoulder. It's a start, she murmured. Jalen exhaled slowly, because he knew the truth. They hadn't wanted to hold Daniels accountable. They had just been forced to. And if they could cover for him again, they would. Jalen looked down at his bruised wrists. He wasn't going to let that happen, because this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about all of them, and he wasn't backing down. The news of Officer Daniels' suspension spread fast, but Jalen knew better than to celebrate, because a suspension wasn't justice. It was a stalling tactic, a way for the system to calm the public down, to make people think change was coming while they waited for the outrage to fade. Jalen had seen it before. Cops went on leave, investigations dragged on, and then, weeks, months later, the officer was quietly reinstated. Like nothing ever happened. Like the victim never mattered. Jalen refused to let that happen. That night, the protests didn't die down. They grew. Thousands filled the streets, marching downtown, demanding not just suspensions, but charges. Jalen stood in the middle of it all, surrounded by people chanting his name, holding signs with his face on them. It was surreal, overwhelming. Yo, you good? Malik, his best friend, nudged him. Jalen nodded slowly. I didn't ask for all this. Malik exhaled. Yeah, well, none of us do, but here we are. Jalen looked around at the people surrounding him. This wasn't about just him anymore. This was about every black man who had been pulled over for no reason. Every mother who had lost her son to a badge. Every name that had turned into a hashtag before the world moved on. Not this time. This time, they weren't letting it go. Inside the police station, Captain Monroe watched the protests on the monitors, his jaw tightening. Jesus, one officer muttered. They're still out there. They're not going away, Monroe said grimly. Daniels, sitting in the corner with a scowl on his face, scoffed. They'll get tired. They always do. Monroe shot him a cold look. No, Daniels, they won't. Because this wasn't just another case. This was the case that had gone viral. This was the case that had people watching. And the system could only protect its own in the shadows. But right now, there were too many damn lights on. Jalen didn't stop fighting. He spoke at rallies. He met with civil rights attorneys. He went on national television, looking America in the eye and telling the truth. And the pressure kept building. A week later, the announcement finally came. Officer Daniels to face charges of false arrest and excessive force. Jalen read the headline 3 times before it sank in. His mother placed a hand on his back. Baby, you did it. Jalen exhaled, his chest tight. Number we did. Because it wasn't just him. It was the people, the protests, the voices that refused to be silenced. For once, the badge didn't win. For once, the truth was louder. And for the first time in a long time, Jalen felt something that had always seemed just out of reach. Hope, the end.